And that's what concerns us, particularly regarding the issue of race. And we can see today that although I and others, some people may say, well, race doesn't matter anymore in American society, we're all equal. Well, you just have to look at data, and that's why black lives have never mattered related to white lives, just like Native American lives have never mattered, have mattered less than white lives. You just look at the data, it's an empirical thing. Look at income, look at occupation, look at death rates, look at housing. A whole slew of empirical indicators point out that those respective groups their lives have never mattered as much. So that's the importance to me of the movement, was bringing it to our attention. It isn't that it hasn't existed. It's existed since I've been around as a professional and much longer. It's that we're finally paying attention to it. Just like murdered and missing indigenous women. That's been around for, I spent 20 years in Canada as practicing law and researching and stuff. They first addressed this issue, but that's been around, again, for decades. But we're finally paying attention, I guess that. So what we found was disproportionality, more probability. And the fact that when African Americans are subject to police homicide, they're less likely than whites to have weapons. They're less likely to be threatening, contrary to what our image, which is so important in terms of crime. And we point out particular data, and then we start to talk about a little bit about reform. And that's what the chiefs talk about. What do we do? We've got disproportionality. We've got evidence that via video that contradicts official police versions. So that suggests to us that we need to have more accountability, more review of police actions. So we have a slew of legislation across the nation which has arisen. And most of it, including in Washington State, isn't that controversial. In fact, where did I go to find out commentary on the laws? The Washington State Association of Police Sheriffs, okay? Chiefs and sheriffs. As they say, they hope that hope this legislation helps to reduce violence and reduce tension. But, and most of it's not, I said, not controversial. Of course, there are particular things that are controversial. One is use of force. When use of force can be, the type of use of force that can be used. And yeah, it does create more constraints on law enforcement. Okay? No chokeholds. You have to use the continuum of force and try to de-escalate. You can't just jump into use of excessive force. That's what's taught on the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission, but it always isn't followed. This standardizes it throughout the state. Now, another issue is addressing suspects or persons with mental health crisis. Initially, there was a lot of, let's say, negative comments, or several negative comments from law enforcement agencies that this kind of handcuffs them. They can't deal with mental health calls and stuff. Well, and that's not necessarily true. They can. They can still restrain. There's more controls on the extent to which they can use force. But what that suggests is a solution, which is part of the legislation too, that we get innovative and start using mental health professionals more with police and others in dealing with issues, because we know that a large proportion of incidents, and particularly serious incidents, involve people who are in mental crisis, mental problems. So that isn't what police are trained in specifically. We can't expect them to be trained in that. There was research, I believe it was in Seattle, that showed that about 50% of 911 calls have to do with mental health issues. Tragically, of course, some of these police homicides involve persons who were in distress, right? So the legislation, yes, it does create new standards, but the other pieces of legislation provide opportunities that there can be innovation in addressing calls. Another area is high-speed chases. Okay? The Washington State Association of Police Chiefs and Sheriffs points out that, well, they're limited now already by departments. That's uneven. This is setting state standards, so different departments have different counties, different cities have different policies. This sets a statewide policy, and basically what it says is that unless there's serious threat to you or the public, for minor offenses, don't pursue shoplifting, whatever, right? I mean, George, what was George Floyd's crime? Counterfeiting, right? $20. Counterfeit bill. Ellis, well, there wasn't any, but anyway, so minor offenses, let's not chase. You have to remember, this protects officers too. About 40% of police fatalities across the country have to do with automobile accidents. We tend to think, of course, police fatalities, tragedies like we had a few years ago, where an officer is murdered. No, that's only about 50%. And fortunately, it's low. Policing itself is a very safe profession. It's not even in the top 20 of occupational death rates, right? So, even though on TV and all that, they're getting shot all the time. Fortunately, that isn't the case. So, yeah, that does constrain pursuits, but it's healthy for officers and the public. Again, the egregious case of that happens, officer going through an intersection and hitting somebody in pursuit. So lesser offenses, there's not going to be pursuit.